In the last episode, we built the rollover protection for the Caterpillar 988F. In this episode, I'm going to be building all of the body panels for the fuel tank and for the shroud that covers the hydraulic tank. Before anything is added to the model, I first need to remove a bunch of stuff that I don't need. That's going to include the ladders that are cast into the side of the body, as well as all of the little spots where you see I've highlighted it in red. That's all material that needs to go away so that I can fit all of the new replacement parts in. The cutting bit that I selected for this was a little bit too weak. I eventually ended up changing it out for a much sharper one, but I unfortunately forgot to record that part. The part that you can see here is the back of where the hydraulic tank would be. This part was cast in, however, it's not supposed to be there. There's actually like a cylindrical tank that would fit into this area, but for the sake of easy casting, Ertl ended up just squaring it out, so I'm removing it by cutting it and then snapping it off with this. And then later I'll come back in with a rotary tool and start to clean up all that leftover material that's in there. And up in here is the area where that tank will eventually get installed. That won't be happening in this episode. I need to get a 3D printer so that I can start making some of the smaller plastic parts that I don't really want to do by hand. Not that I don't want to do them, it's just that I want them to come out really accurate. To design the pieces that are going to go on the outside, I used my good tried and true method of utilizing Inkscape to design everything in 2D and then importing it over to the program that I use for all of my CNC work. Before getting busy with cutting this stuff out, I need to situate it on the workspace here to make sure that I'm not using too much space, not wasting material, because the brass is kind of expensive for what it is. So I want to make sure that everything is organized. Once I get everything squared away, then I got to come in and create what are called tool paths. So those orange outlines that you see is the outside of the piece. Then the blue outline is where the cutting tool is going. The black lines are where I'm going to make my score marks. So the brass that I used for this part is actually relatively thin brass. I was able to do pretty light score marks on it, which is going to make bending it into shape a lot easier. I'll use a combination of these flat nose pliers and then also just using my fingers and holding the piece of metal against the machine and then bending it into shape. I didn't realize until I started working on this project how many differences there were between the 988B fuel tank and the 988F fuel tank. The 988F fuel tank has got quite a lot of intricacy to it. I think it's probably because it has a much larger capacity than the B tank. But it's one of the cool parts about doing projects like this is you really do learn a lot about the machines that you wouldn't otherwise already know. I'll need to create a piece from scratch to fill in this section right here. And I will utilize the same bending techniques for creating the shroud that's going to go around the hydraulic fluid tank. piece of this shroud was just a little bit too long, so after fitting it and deciding where I need to make the cut, I used a handsaw to remove the little bit of material that I didn't need to shorten up the face of it. Even though I use the CNC machine for most of my cutting these days, I still really do like making parts for the machine from scratch. And I do think that soldering parts together is still one of my favorite things to do. There's something that requires a lot of attention, and I really do like going in and cleaning up the solder and smoothing out all the joints. Now I'm just superficially smoothing out these parts here. Towards the end of the project, before I go into the primering state, I will go and clean everything up even more. For creating the bottom of the fuel tank, I made that part from scratch as well. I set the piece that I was adapting this to on top of a piece of brass, scored out the shape that I needed, and then cut it out on the disc sander. Nice, clean fit. To close off the inside of the tank, I elected to use putty instead of using a sheet of brass, but so that I wasn't using up a whole ton of putty, I decided to use a little bit of scrap wood to fill in the void that is inside the tank. Next, I rough up the inside of the tank itself to fit on the outside with some super glue. And then I'll begin filling in the rest of it with putty. To pack all the putty into the various voids, I use a wooden clay sculpting knife. Seems to work best, and I find that most of the time the putty doesn't actually stick to it. And once the putty is cured, I can take a file and smooth it down nice and flat. A little bit of creativity was needed to get the angles that are in there, but the end result ended up coming out pretty good. And once everything is primed and painted up, it'll look pretty nice. The last piece for the tank is this back panel right here, which is just designed to make everything line up. I'll hold it in place with more of the putty that I used for the filler instead of using super glue because it will help fill in the void and then help clean up the last little bit of that detail. There was a little piece of added detail that I had to put on the little valance cover that's over where the hydraulic tank is going to be, and it didn't come out quite the way I wanted it to, but I didn't want to unsolder it and put it back together, so I ended up just using a little bit of solder and some putty to fill it in and get it squared away. The cast metal for the loader is pretty slick, so putting in a few scrapes and gouges into it will help the super glue bond to it a little bit better. And here it is, pretty much done. There will be some other details that need to go on the outside of this later. Railings, a little bash guard, maybe a peep window for the fluid level, and then of course the actual hydraulic tank that's going to need to sit up inside that shroud. But here it is. All of the body panels for the hydraulic tank and the fuel tank are finished. The next episode I will begin working on all of the panels for the engine cover. We'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.